podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn and welcome to How We're the podcast from Roker Report. And once again, we look at what's happening on the pitch during this international break, or maybe off the pitch actually, because I'd rather ignore what's happening on the pitch. A little faux pas there. And as the club's accounts were released recently, we thought we'd get a couple of people to talk through that and potentially delve deeper into football finances in general. And to do this, we need a couple of people who know a lot more on the subject than I do. So firstly, I'm very pleased to be joined by a regular Roker Report contributor. He's also a clever fella with money and numbers and all that, because I'm going to quiz him potentially on my current tax situation after this recording. It's Gary Winder. Hello, Gary.
How you doing, Chris? Good to be on. Good to see you again.
Good stuff, yeah. So you're a money fella. Does that mean, you can find ways for people like, Jimmy Carr not to pay taxes and all that sort of stuff? Is that what you do?
I knew you were going to go down that road. That's not quite how it works. I am chartered tax advisor, but mainly corporates in that sense, not the personal stuff I try to avoid.
Right. Well, I may keep you on this call after we're all done. So just hang fire, don't hang up. But of course, we couldn't talk about football finance without our second guest. According to Wikipedia, he is the Columbo of football finance, as well as the Rain Man of football finance. He's, of course, the ultimate voice when it comes to money in football. It is, of course, Kieran Maguire. Hello, Kieran.
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for the invite. Don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia. That particular comment, in terms of the Rain Man, did include another word before Rain Man, a word beginning with F, which came from a club owner in the EFL when I had been questioning some of their scamp-like behaviour.
I imagine there's probably one or two names as well that might have behind, in other clubs behind the scenes when you're poking into stuff. But thanks again for coming on. We always appreciate your time as always, because when I'm kind of doing background reading on the topic, I can see just how much you're in demand at the moment. I mean, do you think football finance has ever been such a hotly debated topic?
Certainly not. I mean, it's been absolutely crazy in the last few years. I mean, when I started formally teaching this, which was about 12 years ago at the University of Liverpool, you get the odd enquiry. But I think since the addition of a couple of zeros into every set of accounts compared to where we were 30 years ago, since the creation of financial fair play and other attempts to manipulate spending and manipulate money coming into clubs in terms of targets, it has become part of the football landscape. And I would just happen to be there. I mean, I'm still the mini-me as far as I'm concerned to Swiss Ramble, who for me is the governor of football finance. But he lives in Switzerland. He's an absolutely brilliant guy. So I sort of get a lot of the flack for it here in the UK. And I've always tried to treat every club with equal respect. So last week I was on a podcast for Farnborough Football Club, who I had to find out where Farnborough was on the map, and then try to look at their finances. So yeah, for me, I'm a geeky nerd. I like mucking around with numbers, and it's sort of become a bit of a game of whack-a-mole these days with some of the things that some clubs are up to, which makes it sort of fun. Yeah, as much fun as you can be as an accountant. Yeah, and that's not, those words are not normally mentioned in the same sentence. It has to be said.
Yeah, and I can say Gary laughing at that. but I think I saw that on your social media feed. I think it was it Weddleston or Farnborough, something. Someone had lost 200 grand. And I thought, I hadn't realised you delved down into the kind of non-league, seventh tier or whatever it is.
I'll check up. I've got a set of alerts. I use Google alerts and I use company house alerts, and they ping me practically every day and at every hour. And sometimes it will be, I'm obsessed with the subject. So sometimes it might be 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and I'll get a ping through my phone, and I'll get out the iPad, and then the wife will wake up and she says, "What are you looking at 3 o'clock in the morning?" Yeah, because I think many wives are suspicious, and they say, "Oh yeah, Walsall have just updated their shares." And she goes, "Why can't I just married a normal bloke who would be watching something more deviant than that?" But it's financial porn for me, I guess, is what I specialise in.
I had that scene from the IT crowd in my head there when he got up during the night. But anyway, looking back in football, when it was kind of the local businessman back in the day, he made a few bob and he supported a club, so he bought the club and he was paying more for the limelight in more ways, than to make money from the club. Do you think it's the same now, but just on a bigger scale with nations doing it rather than individuals?
I think you're absolutely right. We all can remember watching Match of the Day way back when, and if a club was doing well, then the cameras would turn to the director's box, and there'd be a bloke there, and he'd always be wearing a hat, and sometimes it might be a couple of members of his family, and he'd be having a cigar or a cigarette and a pint and so on. And he says, "Oh yeah, Dave such and such, who's made his money from scrap metal." It was always something like that. He's proudly put, and it used to be sort of a bit of kudos on a local basis. But when we now look at ownership motives, and when we have switched from football ownership being a domestic issue, because before Roman and Abramovich, there was nobody overseas that wanted to invest in English football, because it was a pariah industry into a certain extent. What was a bit of a pariah country as far as intrigue was concerned. I think the success of the Premier League has attracted, and I'm not here to try to persuade people to buy the book, but in the book I've said there's 4 reasons to buy a football club, and I call those profit, love, vanity, and insanity. And you do have now the fact that there is money to be made from football. You've got people who have come into the game, normally American investors, who are looking to make buck from flipping the club when they sell it. And the Glazers have been very successful at that at Manchester United. FSG have sold 10% of Liverpool and got their money back. So they own 90% of Liverpool, and effectively it's cost them nothing. So we do see some people making money out of it. I think you still have the local lad or lass made good, but they're very much in the minority. You look at the ownership of clubs in the Premier League, for example, and there's 2 or 3 clubs owned by local fans. Steve Parish at Palace, Tony Bloom at Brighton, Matthew Benham at Brentford. Then you've got sort of the vanity purchase. I'd say that Jim Ratcliffe at Manchester United, that's a vanity purchase, because he was a Chelsea season ticket holder who tried to buy Chelsea 3 years ago. And when that failed, he suddenly remembered, I was born in Manchester. I'm just remembered that I'm a Manchester United fan, despite the fact that I've had a Chelsea season ticket. And then you get lunatics. Football's like a moth to a flame when it comes to attracting nutters. And I'm restricted for legal grounds on being able to comment on some of them. But you think about what happened at Darlington, which is not too far from your neck of the woods, with the Reynolds Arena and all of the crazy stuff there. You look at Cellino at Leeds United, who was superstitious about the number 14. So he had all of the number 14s removed from the seat numbers at Ellen Road, and he didn't like the colour purple, so he couldn't have the colour purple anywhere. So absolutely crazy tales. And there's one guy who bought a club. It wasn't going very well. He agreed to sell it, and he said to the buyer, "You can buy it next Monday." And then on the Saturday, he took out all of the card reading terminals. And we're talking about a very well-known EFL club, took away all of the card reading terminals from the ground, so that all the fans had to pay cash for catering, for merchandise, whatever they bought, new owners coming in. And that cash was never seen again. These are the sort of the amazing stories. And I think football is like no other industry in that regard for sheer craziness. And I'd love to be able to tell you about the money laundering. I'd love to be able to tell you about the the owners who had a cocaine problem, who owed money to their dealer, and money was going out to pay the dealer. But I think for the sake of you as broadcasters and me as an individual, I won't go any further than that.
Yeah, I remember when Faustino Asprilla turned up at Darlington. A day you probably, I imagine Darlington fans never forget. But I mean, just on that, as a high level question from a complete amateur like I am, because everything I read and hear around this topic seems to be negative. I think only 4 clubs made a profit in 22-23. Something like 85% of clubs operate at a loss. There's fan protests against, ticket prices. Fans are finding ways to watch football other than the official 3 or 4 subscriptions that they need to watch all the football by official means. So in general, from a high level, is football in a bad shape when it comes to finances? Or is it just fine to roll along as it is?
It's fine until it's not fine. I mean, it's a bit like the horse racing industry in the sense that if you own a horse, you're going to lose money. If you are a wealthy individual, and I've got friends that own part shares in horses, and they say, we go along to the races when our horse runs a couple of times a year. We get into the winner's enclosure occasionally. It's good fun, but it's a loss-making enterprise. And provided you are wealthy enough to be able to subsidise your racehorse, then it's just a hobby. It's exactly the same in football, but with quite a few additional zeros into what you're covering. So I did another Championship club podcast last night. I went on the Millwall podcast, and Millwall, they tend to go under the radar. Don't get a lot of attention. They've not got the best of reputations for some aspects of the club, but actually they do an awful lot of good work locally. Their owner put in 17 million quid last year, and people are going, "What? Millwall? Never. It can't be right." And if you've got that wealth, then it's fine. Effectively, you've got the owners subsidising the losses of football. And if that owner can't do it, one of 2 things happens. Either A, there's another fool. And we often refer to this, the find a bigger fool theory of football ownership. Or the fans rally round and it goes into effectively sort of special measures. You get sort of a fan-owned club arises, you look to see what happened at Portsmouth, you look to see what happened at Wrexham. And then when somebody else then comes in a few years later, and we saw that with Michael Eisner at Pompey and of course Reynolds and McElhenney at Wrexham, it goes back into private ownership and it starts to make bigger losses and be subsidised and so on. So I think actually football's in a good position because it is so ridiculously popular. If you compare football to rugby union, where we've lost Worcester Warriors, we've lost London Irish, we've lost, is it Wasps? We've lost 3 senior rugby union clubs over the course of the last 2 years because there isn't that long line of other people saying, I've been really good at running a phone company. I've been really good at running a plastic box manufacturing company. Therefore, I must be good at running a football club. And they get involved only to find that football is like, I've spoken to club owners and they'll say things to me. I came in and I was going to do everything right. I set myself a budget. I tell the manager, this is how much you got to spend. You can do this, you can do that. And it comes to January and we're 8th or 9th in the table. And this came from somebody senior at a Championship club. And we'd already spent our transfer budget for the year. So it was January. I think we're 8th or 9th in the table. The manager comes to me and says, I've seen this lad. I've seen this lad from Portugal or Belgium or somewhere. We can get him for 6 million. I know we've already spent the money. He's looking for 25 grand a week. I know the other lads are on, but look at his YouTube reel. I look good. If you look at my walking football YouTube reel, I'd probably look half decent. And then the owner says, my head says no, my heart says go. And they listen to their heart and they sign the player and he scores 3 goals in 14 games. They still finish 8th, and now they've got him for the next 3 years on 25 grand a week. And you've got the legacy from a hastily made, heart-driven decision. And that's part of the beauty of football. It's wonderful until that owner their circumstances change. So we saw that at Bury, where it was owned by a guy called Stuart Day, who was making money from some very unusual car park leasing and student accommodation leasing businesses, and he sold the club for £1 to a bottom feeder called Steve Dale, who effectively destroyed the club, and we lost Macclesfield as well. But even when we get so close, you get to it's a bit like the doomsday clock. You get to 11:59 and 52 seconds. Normally, somebody will come in. You think about what happened at Derby. They were pretty close to liquidation because the administration wasn't working out. Villa were very, very close to going bust at one stage, and you look at where Villa are now. They're top half of the Premier League, Champions League, and so on. Football just attracts people to a bit like, a James Bond film. Just when you think James Bond is going to be eaten by the sharks, somebody comes along in a helicopter and takes him away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just listen to that, Gary, because obviously you work in finance, but not the football kind of specifically. But, it sounds to me, again, not an expert, you'll know more than me, but when an industry, plays by its own rules historically, you think of the housing market, you think of maybe the dot-coms, early 2000s or whatever. It sounds, from what Kieran's saying, football's in its own bubble that's just built on this assumption that rich people keep the money rolling in. I mean, is it, from your point of view, sitting outside and not looking at football specifically, would you say, well, at some point it could just pop?
It was an interesting comparison you just made there, Chris. Yeah, I've often thought, are there mirror images in the wider economy like housing? You mentioned there is this element that feels like a bubble, and Kieran's spot on there, as in football going down this path is going to survive just as long as more wealthy people keep investing in it and keep this bubble going. And I guess in the wider economy, you have got what feels like a big wealth inequality gap just getting bigger and bigger since, I'd say certainly around COVID, it's accelerated. And by virtue of that, I think therefore you've got more wealthy people in the world. There's probably more potential scope for football clubs keep being bought, basically. So I can only see this bubble getting bigger and bigger. I don't know, it might be a question for Kieran, but I'm not sure how this ends. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just does keep going. I think UEFA, the Premier League, try to enforce various rules to try and keep competition at its peak, but it seems very difficult to pass those rules. It's not in the best interests of a lot of clubs out there. Naturally, the elite clubs want to stay elite. So I guess I'll pass that back to Kieran. How do you think that looks in the future? I think we've seen it with, was it the APTs, Associated Party Transaction Regulations we saw with the commercial deals deemed to be not market value. And you could see some of the clubs that oppose that, for example.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Everybody acts in self-interest. I have absolutely no issue with that whatsoever, because all three of us, we operate on a self-interest basis every day of the week. Well, we put our families first, we put our personal preferences first, and so on. Football club owners do the same. The rules that we have at present have been voted, and people, I think, make the mistake. They think that the Premier League or the EFL is the decision-making body. It's not. The EFL and the Premier League, they're the equivalent of the civil servants. They apply the rules. They don't actually create the rules themselves. The Premier League is a limited company. It's got 21 shareholders. So each club in the Premier League, it has a vote. The FA has a vote as well, although it never uses it. It's pretty useless, the FA, when it comes to the professional game. And if you want to change the rules, you need a 2/3 majority. So you've got to be able to persuade people to go along with some form of financial rules. The rules in their present form, in my view, are not fit for purpose because they preserve the status quo. They reinforced existing gaps. Although it is, I think it's quite exciting this season to see that we are having quite a few more clubs genuinely being challengers. The rules encourage clubs to overspend because you're allowed to lose £105 million over 3 years, which by the time you adjust for infrastructure and the women's team and the academy and so on means you can lose 200. So it's not sustainable, even though they're called profitable and sustainable rules. So the rules are a bit rubbish. And when they were invented, Yeah, look, I'm just a teacher. I've been teaching since the 1980s. I just wrote down a list of 10, 12 schemes that I thought would easily get around the rules, and I've just been ticking them off. And I'm thinking, well, if I can do that, if you've got the best brains of the legal profession and the accounting profession and the finance profession, they can come up with 30 or 40 schemes to get around these rules, and that's what we have seen. So it's created a new industry, in sports law, in sports finance, which is all about compliance. And what does compliance mean? Compliance means breaking the rules without breaking the rules. It's breaking the spirit of the rules without breaking the letter of the rule. So we do have an environment which is silly, but I don't see the bubble bursting. I think there will always be more people coming into the game. We saw with Super League and Project Big Picture exactly what the big clubs want, which is they want to have complete control. So under Project Big Picture, effectively the whole of the English game of football would be determined by 6 votes. And those 6 votes would be the 6 clubs, or 6 of the clubs who had been in the Premier League the longest. So we know who we're talking about under those circumstances. And I then say, well, hold on. How many matches have the Glazers been to? Stan Kroenke, Roman Abramovich, Sheikh Mansour, Joe Lewis at Spurs, and so on. These people, they don't attend football matches, and yet they would have been in charge of distribution. They would have been in charge of the de-risking of the game. So we'd have had a smaller Premier League. 2 clubs would have been kicked out of effectively the professional pyramid because it had gone down to 90 teams and so on. And this was being sold to the other clubs as a fantastic step forwards. Super League was on the basis of the clubs in the Premier League have been extracting more and more concessions from UEFA and more concessions from the other clubs in the Premier League. And then they said, oh, we want even more. We want to be even more greedy. It's a bit like Putin with Ukraine. He wants more and more from the deal. But the difference was that, and I don't think I've ever been prouder to be a football fan when football fans, and this is the football fans of Chelsea and Liverpool and Manchester United, the clubs who would have benefited most of all, they said, we're not prepared to accept this because whilst we have a financial advantage, we still want to qualify for the Champions League by being in the top 4. We don't want jeopardy to be removed. We don't want to be in a sealed US style franchise product, but that's what the owners want. So I think sort of that battle for sort of the soul of football, for want of a better phrase, is something which will continue. But the finances, will we lose another club in the next 10 years? Possibly, but I'd say it's a possible rather than a probable. And it'll be a small club.
Yeah. Well, I think those clubs fans fought it because they might miss out on a trip to Sunderland, if I'm completely honest, Kieran. Exactly. But I mean, just on that rule breaking, because there's the aspect that you're talking about where clubs are getting around those rules by finding ways to, restructure, as you said. But there also seems to be this, and it's happened a couple of times recently, and I'm thinking Forest, I'm thinking potentially Everton, where clubs have almost blatantly broken the rules because it's almost thinking, well, actually, why don't we just break the rules because it's worth the risk, because we'll end up making all of that money back anyway. And if you look in the case of Forest, a couple of seasons later, they're in the Champions League and their owners are making loads of money. So why don't more clubs might look at that and think, well, let's just break the rules because actually we'll get more back in the long run?
Well, I think some clubs have cynically thought this thing through and said, if we break the rules, and there's a separate issue. Are the rules rubbish? But if we do break the rules, we'll probably get somewhere between a 4 and a 6 point deduction. But by spending this extra amount of money, we think we can get an extra 10 points. So actually, on a net basis, we're better off. And therefore, I wouldn't say it's a cynical decision, but it's a logical decision from the point of view of the clubs involved. We wait to see what are the ultimate consequences of this, because as we speak, recording this, there's a dispute going through between Burnley and Everton, because Burnley were relegated in one of the years where Everton breached the spending limits, and Burnley's argument is that if Everton had been forced to stay within the rules, they would have got fewer points. Burnley would have avoided relegation, and therefore Burnley would have received another year's worth of Premier League broadcast income. And how this one is going to be determined, we have to wait and see. I am fully aware. Again, sometimes I do expert witness work for disputes between clubs, and there have been similar disputes that have taken place historically, which I can't talk about for legal reasons, where settlements have been made, but that's gone completely under the radar. So there are things taking place in football which are weird and wonderful, which we never get to hear about.
Yeah. I remember the famous Sheffield United West Ham one back in the day with Tevez and Mascherano. But these rules as well, and people finding ways around them and things like this, it seemed to me to lead to a word that seems to be used a lot more in football than it used to, and I think it really I don't think the older generation like it, but it's the model that people talk of. You look at the likes of clubs like Brighton, Brentford, Bournemouth, throw them in there, and you look at what they've done, and it's usually, when you think about it, it's not really rocket science, because actually what it boils down to is just good recruitment and making good decisions on when to sell players and making sure you've already got someone to come through. And it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it does seem like some are taking this to the extreme in terms of buying almost exclusively young players.
It is. I mean, I teach at a management school. I teach for the Professional Footballers Association. I teach for the League Managers Association. So when I've got my students, I say, okay, let's identify why some clubs are more successful than others, and we narrow it down to three things. First of all, resources. So if you take a club like Manchester United, it's got the biggest stadium in the country, it's got the biggest fan base in the country, it's arguably got, I'd say it's probably got the biggest Premier League fan base on the planet. So it's got financial resources, it's got geographic resources, in the sense that the Northwest is an area which is attractive to players, because there are lots of footballers around there, and footballers quite like to be around other footballers. So I used to do a lot of running, and I was living in Cheshire, so I would run past all of the footballers' houses, because they were all in the same type of streets, in sort of areas like Wilmslow and Alderley Edge and so on. And I've nearly been run over by Jordan Henderson on a couple of occasions when he comes zooming out of his place when I'm sort of gasping, so sort of running up a hill outside his gaff and so on. So you've got resources, financial, geographical, talent. The Northwest, Northeast. These are areas which are areas which generate a lot of footballers. You've got opportunities. Why are Celtic not a bigger club? Because they're in Scotland. So you don't have the opportunities in Scotland or Belgium or some of the other countries in Europe to be as successful, because you are geographically restricted. So you look at opportunities, and again, that can be a geographical, that could be on the basis of the competitions in which you play. If you look at African football, why doesn't African football become more successful? It's because the opportunities in terms of broadcast deals and sponsorship deals don't exist over there. And the third thing is the quality of executive decision making. And this is the area where those clubs, Bournemouth, Brighton, I'd say include Palace, Brentford, this is where these clubs have excelled. They've got very much a culture and an identity in terms of player recruitment, in terms of player welfare. You get to hear about how they're looking after the players, that they've got the opportunity that they can go to players and say, we can offer you a career pathway. So come to us. You can either have a long career with us and you'll be on 50, 60, 70 grand a week. We'd all take that. Or if it works out in 2 years' time, you can go and join Chelsea, you can go and join Liverpool, you can double your money, and you'll be playing in the Champions League, and you'll be having the plaudits that go along with playing with the league club. And that's actually very attractive to a player in terms of their development. And I think those particular clubs have been very good at having an executive making those decisions, saying, this is the way that we are going to do things. There is going to be a Bournemouth way, a Brighton way, a Brentford way, and they stick to it. And because they are smaller clubs, you know, I'm a Brighton fan, but I know where we are in the wider scheme of things. Because we're smaller clubs, it means that you can ignore the noise. And one of the big problems with football is that there's an awful lot of noise. So when Brighton lost 7-0 at Nottingham Forest, the owner said, yeah, shit, things happen. And then they went on to win the next 6 games.
Yeah.
But if that had been a big club, for one of the better, all the pressure would have been on the players and the manager. Is the manager now going to get the sack and so on? And when you talk to people within the industry, they say sometimes the owners will listen to the noise because they want to be liked. So you know, I do work with the League Managers Association, and the evidence is if you change your manager, it doesn't improve things. But what does it do? It buys time for the owner because you are seen to have been listening to the fans. And yeah, I'm a football fan, but you know, working with professionals in the game has told me one thing. I know absolutely nothing about football because if I sit in the canteen with some of the lads from the PFA and listening to them talk about technical, tactical, diet, sports science, all of the things which have an impact upon their ability to be elite professionals, I go, well, I just thought that player was a bit crap last week, so therefore he should be dropped. And you realise you know nothing. I think as football fans, we think we know a lot more about the game than we do, and therefore we think that our opinions should be listened to. But if I go and watch Holby City every week, it doesn't mean that I'd make a good surgeon because I know ultimately I know nothing, and that's what we're doing as football fans. We think we know a lot more about the game than we do, and we think because you've got cliches like he's lost the dressing room. That's, you know, and you go on to talk sport. Yeah. It's clear he's lost the dressing room, and you know, Jason Cundy would go, oh yes, you're right there, and they're just talking garbage. Those clubs who have the ability to say, we looked at the metrics. So when Brighton lost 7-0 at Forest, the metrics said, yeah, Forest were the better team. Brighton had 70% possession. Forest probably should have won about 3-1. But it was just one of those matches where every time they attacked, they scored and so on. And I think if you've got people that can ignore that noise, it really improves the efficiency of the clubs. So it is good to see, I think some owners are adopting a model and sticking to it. And that's the tough thing to do, you know, to have a strategy and to believe in it and to stick in it and to say, follow me. And, you know, we will, you know, because when Brighton's owner said, I think it was 5 years ago, we're sacking Chris Hughton because we want to be a top 10 Premier League club. All the Brighton fans turn around and go, what, you've been smoking? And now, you know, Brighton last 3 seasons, 6th, 9th, 11th, Europa League last season, you know, top 10 this season. Now we realise that he had the vision, he had the strategy, he had the model. And I honestly think as fans, we should simply just go along to the match, have a few beers, have a knees up, have a bit of a laugh with our mates, and leave the professional stuff to the professionals.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll cut that bit and stick it on the socials because how relevant it is to Sunderland. But we'll circle back to that when we come on to the Sunderland accounts, because you were talking about the noise in the background with Brighton being able to do that. But as you were talking, I was thinking specifically of Daniel Levy at Spurs, who seems to not listen to the noise, but he seems to have some sort of model. He's running a sustainable club. Finances seem to be in a good place, but he seems to be the villain.
Well, Spurs are the most profitable club in the history of the Premier League, but you don't get a trophy for it. And I think when Spurs moved to the new stadium, the cost of tickets went very, very high. And they've taken away concessions from senior fans. They've alienated an element of the fan base. And I think that the Spurs fans bought into tolerate having to schlep your way to Wembley's a pain in the arse to get to. Yeah, once every few seasons for a playoffs final or something, or a cup final, whatever it's going to be. Yeah, it's a great day out. Doing it every week is bad news. So, do 2 years at Wembley. You'll go to this amazing new stadium. I don't know whether any of you guys have been there, but it is incredible. It's like a spaceship has landed in that particular part of North London. And we will start to reap the rewards. And of course, they haven't. And the fans are having a go at him. But Spurs have spent far more money since moving to the new stadium than they were at the old stadium. They've just not spent it well. And that's a separate issue. So he does get the flack. And when he's being paid £6 million a year, including a bonus, as it was a couple of years ago, fans will say, well, he doesn't know what we're going through. But from a business point of view, I think he sets a gold standard. It's just, football's not a business. Football's a love affair. You think about the relationship with the person that you love most of all, your partner, whoever that's going to be. It's not done for profit, is it? It's done for love, and that's our relationship with a football club. I always say to people, if I look at the top 10 moments of my life, or if I talk to a football fan about the top 10 moments of their life, 6 or 7 of them are going to involve your football club. That last minute goal, that promotion parade, whatever it's going to be, that time at Wembley. It doesn't mean that you don't remember the birth of your kids or the day you got married. And sometimes that they might be even in the top 3 of the best 10 moments of your life. Don't tell your wife that. But football is a unique love affair, and therefore, if you've got somebody as efficient, and Daniel's a very, very smart guy, but what he lacks is people skills, and that's why he's alienated himself from the Spurs fan base.
Is there a degree of fickleness to that, Kieran? Just in terms of, I look at Spurs and think they've had a relative amount of success, not in terms of trophies, but they've been competitive for a long time in the Premier League, which seems to be quite hard to do such a thing when you've got the likes of Man City, Liverpool. Only one team can lift this trophy at the end of the day. Cup finals are a bit of a lottery. So have they just been spoilt? Because I think of friends of mine who got to go to a Champions League final. Myself and Chris could only dream of such a thing. And those same guys will turn around now and the season ticket holders and say, do you know what? Ipswich at home on Saturday, I'm not really interested in that given where we've been.
Yeah, I don't think it's, is it fickle or is it perhaps they start to believe the dream? I go on to when Spurs publish their accounts, bit like today, I'll go on to a Spurs podcast and we talk about the numbers and they'll be having a bit of a moan. And I've said, well, historically, Spurs have had the 5th or 6th highest wage bill in the Premier League. Where do you, if you were talking about any other club than Spurs who had the 5th or 6th highest wage bill in the Premier League, where would you expect them to finish in the table on average? And they go, well, 5th or 6th. I said, well, that's what you've got. And even though Spurs are spending more money on wages, as you rightly say, they're still well behind the 2 Manchester clubs, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal. They did overtake Arsenal for a couple of years because Arsenal went sort of 6 or 7 years without being in the Champions League. But Arsenal are now back in the Champions League and their wage bill's gone through the roof again. So you are where you're supposed to be. We don't want to be where we're supposed to be. That's not the dreaming. And when you've got the best stadium in the country as they have, you can understand the frustration. But Spurs probably overperformed for 3 or 4 seasons. And that created a level of expectation that you could move to the mythical next level. And actually, that's incredibly difficult to do, especially on a long-term basis, because as you rightly say, if it's Ipswich at home, can you motivate yourself? It becomes more difficult. I talk to fans of clubs like Stoke and Charlton, and if you go back, and also Bolton, for quite a few years, Stoke used to finish 8th in the Premier League. And when Charlton were there, they were finishing sort of 7th, 8th. And fans started to get bored because there's nothing to play for. It's not a relegation scrap, and you're not going to win the trophies. And therefore they said, we want change. We want to go to the next level. So they got change, and they didn't realise actually that what they had was as good as they could possibly get. And change is not the same as improvement. And that change resulted in them getting relegated. And since Stoke are owned by probably the richest family in the country, certainly the highest paid family in the country. And from your experiences of the Championship the last few years, Stoke, despite all of that money from Bet365, they finish 14th and 15th every season.
Yeah. Just quickly before we leave the Premier League behind, because it's kind of almost just been reminded about the whole saga at Manchester City, and you told us beforehand you're on call for developments there. But I mean, because it's almost like people are trying to drag it out so much that people just forget that it's actually happening and it'll just disappear. But what is the latest with the Manchester City saga?
Well, I think there's two issues relating to Manchester City. We have had the commission hearing into what's called 115. It's actually 130 charges against the club, and those 130 charges that actually be narrowed down to 3. The accusation has been that they've received money from the owner, but they've pretended it to be commercial income because that goes into your PSR calculations. The second accusation is that members of staff are being paid off book. So one of the accusations, for example, is that Roberto Mancini was being paid £2 million a year by City and £2 million a year for doing 4 days of coaching in Abu Dhabi. If he's put it on his tax return, he's done nothing wrong. And I'll be honest, if you're offered £2 million for 4 days of chartered tax advising in, I'm sure it's a reduction on your normal daily rate, but you might consider it. You might consider it. Yeah,
might need to ask Gary. Yeah.
So, that's and the third accusation is that they've not cooperated with the Premier League, and City's argument to that is that they believe that the Premier League's evidence has been obtained through hacking their computer system. So why should they cooperate for an investigation where they believe that private internal information has been obtained illicitly? So that is the charges. And the commission hearing finished, we think, about the 18th of December. So we're now 3 months later. I think it was a 10-week hearing. I think they saw 500,000 pieces of evidence, which is great if you're a photocopier manufacturer. So the commission's heard all the evidence, and we are now we've been told to expect a verdict or a ruling, but not necessarily the verdict. And I was put on standby on Friday, yesterday, today, and so on. But these things have happened before, as to try to sort of to take a quick look and summarise. And people think because I work at a uni, I know a lot more than I do, and I don't. But I still bluff my way through it. So that's where we are in terms of the first issue. The second issue is in relation to these things called associated party transactions, and what that effectively says is that the Premier League has to approve every commercial deal, every sponsorship deal, if it is from somebody who is vaguely connected or vaguely possibly connected. It's a bit like, we can link everything in our lives to Kevin Bacon through seven gaps. If you got something which we vaguely linked to the owners, and Manchester City said, we think this is unfair. We think this is rules are targeting us. And they got support from that, effectively from Newcastle and Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa as well. So and they're taking the Premier League they're charging the Premier League, saying that we've lost some sponsorship deals on the back of that, and therefore we want some form of ratification, or we think that the rules as been proposed are illegal. So there's two separate issues in respect of Manchester City. If Manchester City are found guilty, I think we've got to expect a severe punishment. If they're found guilty of all the charges, I think it's impossible to see how the board of directors can continue in existence, because they have said things which can only be deemed to be untrue, and therefore they've got, from a corporate point of view, that they would have completely failed. If Manchester City win, where does this leave the Premier League executives? Because again, I've spoken to some people quite senior at clubs for the other 14, for want of a better phrase, and the response there was one which quite surprised me. Quite a few of them have said, "We don't give a toss about Manchester City because we're not competing against Manchester City. Yeah, we're competing in those group of clubs who are trying to avoid relegation, who are trying to become middle class. We're not going to win the Premier League ever." So their concern is that the costs of this are they're already more than £50 million in legal fees, and that's for the Premier League, plus potentially another 50 million for Manchester City. If Manchester City win and Manchester City, say, well, we want some form of financial compensation for this, all of a sudden you've got £100 million worth of costs split between 20 clubs in the Premier League. Everybody's £5 million down for a dispute that some of these smaller clubs in the Premier League said, well, we weren't fussed about it in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very strange position.
Yeah. Well, just quickly moving down in the Championship, just very quickly before we get on to Sunderland specifically, just looking at the promoted sides being in the bottom three again, consecutive seasons, I want to kind of touch on the parachute payments and that topic, because if you look at the top three currently in the Championship above us, I mean, they're shopping in a completely different market to the rest of the Championship. And it seems to me, I mean, it's just a basic, obviously looking in for, in a non-financial way. The fact that there's a supposed need for parachute payments suggests to me like something is broken.
Yeah, I think something is broken. For me, parachute payments are not the problem. Parachute payments are an attempt to a solution to a broader problem, which is the fact that since the Premier League started in 1992 and the clubs in the EFL made the biggest mistake in the history of football, because at the time they were offered 25% of a combined TV deal with the Premier League. And the clubs in the EFL says, no, we can do better ourselves. Well, the revenue of clubs in the Premier League has increased by 3,000%. And the broadcast revenue is up by 4,000%. The revenue of clubs in the EFL Championship's gone up by 1,100%. And that includes parachute payments. So the Premier League has grown between 3 and 4 times faster than the Championship, which has meant that the gap has got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And parachute payments were introduced, I think it was in 2006, because there was a genuine fear that clubs being relegated from the Premier League, if they had to drop from, at the time, I think it was probably £50 million of TV money to about 2 million, they had players on contracts and they had to go and pay up those contracts and they go bust. So that was the purpose of parachute payments. And I personally, I'm a reluctant fan of parachute payments. And the reason for this, originally I was opposed to it. And again, it's through communication. It's through sort of trying to interrogate people and to get their perception of things. I spoke to somebody who was a chief executive of, for want of a better phrase, a yo-yo club in the Premier League and the Championship. And I said, okay, well, so what's the score? And he said, well, okay, this is the issue. We want to stay in the Premier League. But in order to do that, we need to sign players who are good enough. Now, if I go to, let's say so, we've just been promoted. I go to a player. I want that player to come here. Without parachute payments, what I'd have to do is to say, I'll pay you a competitive wage in the Premier League. So let's say that's 50 grand a week. But if we are relegated, you've got to take an 80% pay cut. And the player will say, no thanks, mate. I'll stay in Belgium. I'll stay in Portugal. I'll stay in Italy, wherever it is, because I don't have to go through the change of culture. The player's probably thinking, I'm not convinced you're going to stay up. So if I go to that same player and say, look, I pay you 50 grand a week, If you get relegated, it's a 25% relegation drop. So you drop from 50 to 35. And the chances are, if he's a good player, he'll be snapped up by a Premier League club anyway. Then you got more chance of being able to recruit that player, which increases your chances of managing to survive in the Premier League. And it also increases the overall quality of players coming to the Premier League. So that's why I'm sort of reluctantly in favour of parachute payments, because parachute payments make the Championship weaker, but they make the Premier League stronger. And I appreciate, look, you're in the Championship at present, and I think the Championship's brilliant, by the way. We're 8 or 9 years there in Brighton, and it was absolutely fantastic. Absolutely loved it. But the Premier League is broadcast to 190 different countries. I'm very fortunate. I get to teach all around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, whatever it's going to be. People, when they find out what I do, and all of my teachings in the cities of Manchester and Liverpool, it's Manchester United, Liverpool, City, Chelsea, all of these big clubs, and that's all they want to talk about. And it's a fantastic export, the Premier League. So we need to try to make it as competitive as you can. And in order to make the Premier League more competitive, you need to have the better players. And in order for that, you do need parachute payments. I know people say, well, just give them an 80% pay cut. Okay, do that, they won't come. And it also means that those clubs that will get promoted immediately get relegated again. And I know we've seen it for the last 2 seasons. I think that's just an indication of just how good the quality is in the Premier League. And Brighton have been there for 8 years. And during that 8 years, I've seen the quality of not just the elite clubs, but, Brighton played Fulham a couple of weeks. Fulham were brilliant. We got a scrappy victory. Bournemouth, they played brilliant football. And it's because they've been able to sign players for 30 or 40 million pounds, put them on decent wages and say, okay, worse happens, you still be on 40 grand a week. Worst case scenario next year in the Championship. The player's thinking to himself, I don't want to go and play Saturday, Tuesday. I don't want to Saturday. I don't want to have to go and prove myself at Swansea on a Tuesday night. But if the player's half decent, they'll get snapped up by another Premier League club anyway.
Yeah. And in terms of trying to chase them, that's obviously us. We're trying to chase that top 3, and our accounts have recently been released. And I think Gary's itching to kind of question you on that. At the very top level, Kieran, a seemingly consistent £8 million loss, but it's been described as, pretty good finances. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the average losses in the Championship are about 18 million. So if we take a look at the 2 seasons that Sunderland have had in the Championship, it was 9 million in 22-23, 8.7 million last year. That's on the back of some player sales. So the losses would have been 17 million without some player sales. If you take a look at the average, the wages being paid, Sunderland are paying £80 in wages for every £100 that comes through the door. When I was talking to Millwall yesterday, they're paying £120 in wages for every £100. So I think Sunderland are run on a reasonably prudent basis, but the wage bill is okay. It's mid-table as far as Championship club is concerned, probably just slightly above mid-table. So that means that top 10 should be the club's ambition, and then it's a case of coming back to what we were talking about earlier. It's make some good decisions in terms of recruitment, in terms of strategy, culture, all of the boring management school nonsense that I teach on a regular basis. And then you've got that chance of getting into the playoffs. And I think, realistically, top 2's probably pushing it a bit. But if you win the next, the great thing about the Championship, you can go over a period of 3 weeks and you've got 5 fixtures and you win all 5 and everything changes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's why Easter is always a big thing in the Championship. But do you think, obviously, 4 years in League One, do you think we're still kind of recovering from that?
Yeah, I mean, Sunderland have the unenviable moniker of being the only club relegated to League One in receipt of parachute payments who didn't manage to get out of League One. Excuse me. And I think that there were broader issues at the club. And I'm speaking as somebody, I've been on 2 panels with Charlie Methven.
Hmm.
Charlie's an interesting person. I think it's fair to say we don't necessarily see eye to eye on issues, say, on a social level. And he's far more politically orientated than I am. But I do think that there's a hangover from the Stuart Donald era, which have taken their time to unwind. But I think those have now been addressed, and it certainly didn't help the club. But the current regime do appear to be quite professional, and that's a word with a double-edged sword, because I don't want my club to run professionally. I want my club just to go and spend loads of money, which as long as the money doesn't come from me, as a football fan, just spend more. That's the solution to everything. And I think that when Louis Dreyfus came in, there was an expectation, because of the family wealth, that you would be fishing in a different pond. But I think they still had some legacy issues to deal with from the previous regimes. And you'll know yourself from doing tax work that sometimes you inherit a mess from previous ways that companies have been run, and that can't be turned around overnight.
Absolutely. I think, speaking on that, Kieran, I think it started actually with Ellis Short. Before that, he obviously did the honourable thing, wrote off, I think it was something like 150 million of debt, which if he hadn't, we might be having a completely different conversation and probably ranking us with the likes of Farnborough. So Stuart Donald, for me, has come in, wasn't a popular figure, but it feels in hindsight like something that was necessary, as in, I don't think Kyril Louis-Dreyfus had any ambition to come into Sunderland at that point, given the state of affairs in League One. I think it needed someone. He was
probably only about 7 at the time, wasn't he? Yeah, yes, basically, he's very young.
True. But it felt like it needed someone to kind of come in and get their hands dirty. I know, again, Stuart Donald, not that popular, but I think he was the bad guy who had to go line by line in the accounts, trial balance, take it apart, costs cut everywhere, which, again, is not what fans want to hear, but it feels like he put it in a necessary shape that made it attractive to someone like Kyril to buy up. Is that fair?
Possibly. I'm not sure. I think you're being probably more generous to Stuart Donald than I would be, Gary. But he certainly changed things. He had to change things out of necessity because he had limited wealth. Again, far more wealth than any of us, I suspect, on as far as this conversation is concerned. But from a football club owner point of view, he was not in the ultra high net worth category, and therefore there was a limit to how much he could fund the club. I think from day one there was always an eye on the exit door for Donald and Methven, with a view to them leaving the club with more money than they had when they arrived. And that may have been the case. We never really got to the bottom of that. And I've been on Companies House and have looked at quite a few of Stuart Donald's companies, and he does well in some areas and less well in others. And he's an entrepreneur, and good luck to him on that. But he's certainly made changes. Some of those changes had to be made because the step down was so severe in terms of Premier League to League One. And again, if we go back to the issue of parachute payments, without parachute payments, you rightly said, Sunderland could be out of business. And at least having those parachute payments gave the club the ability to acclimatise to a different environment in terms of attendance levels, sponsorship interest, and so on.
Yeah. And I think, Gary, you noticed something in the accounts in terms of the shareholder funds.
Yeah, I mean, it probably isn't anything necessarily to worry about from how I look at it, but there's a note in the accounts about I think the shareholder funds to date, 19.8 million. And the note says that there will be converted into equity in due course. Is that anything we should be worried about, Kieran?
I personally don't think so. And I bow to your greater knowledge here, Gary, because you've got the tax expertise. It could be that as part of a broader issue for personal tax planning, that there could be some benefits in doing this on a graduated basis. I don't see that as being a problem, because the vast majority of owner loans from the current owners of a club to the club itself, similar to what we might refer to as the bank of mum and dad approach, in the sense that, if I sort of look at things from personal experience, our kid passes her driving test, comes to me and says, "Dad, passed my driving test." I say, "Congratulations, that's fantastic news for two levels. A, you passed your driving test, and B, I'm no longer paying for your driving lessons," which I didn't realise. They've gone up a bit since I was a lad, I can assure you. And then the next thing is, I want to buy a car. And I'm going, well, yeah, that's the point of passing your driving test, I presume. And then it's, will you lend me 15 grand? And of course, the word lend, I know that when she says that to me, that I'm never going to ask for the money back. And she knows that the young people today have got a pretty raw deal, that the chances are she'll never be in a position to be able to afford to pay me back. But in theory, it's a loan. Well, that tends to be the same with debt investment by owners into the clubs. And if you take a look at the case of Roman Abramovich, for example, he lent Chelsea £1.6 billion. Chelsea would never be in a position to repay them that. So, convert it to equity at some point in time. In the case of Sunderland and these monies, I think the way it was worded probably raised more questions than answers. But I don't see that as being something to spend any time over. Sunderland don't have £16 million to repay. So, worst case scenario, let's say that Kirill Louis-Dreyfus sells Sunderland, and what he might be able to do is to say, I want that money paid back by the new owners, but I know that they won't be able to afford to do it. So it'll be, I'm aware of some deals for clubs in the Championship where you've had a transfer of ownership, the club's taken over the debt from the old owners, and the way it's been organised, if you get promoted within the next 5 years, then that money has to be repaid. If not, if you don't get into the Premier League, then some of it will be written off, or some of it. So it could be that there's some sort of broader planning which could be connected to Sunderland returning to the Premier League.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we touched on it earlier, that sometimes fans probably like to speculate and act like they know more than they do. And we honestly don't know. I'd say that from my perspective, I've heard some say that there's a lack of commitment there, in that sense, that is he trying to take it out? But I'm not sure I see that. Like you said, there's probably reasons for that. After all, I think Kirill does have a lot of money elsewhere. He's a wealthy guy. He's probably invested in a lot of assets, and it's a case from his personal strategy of where he's deploying that capital and where it's best used. So on one hand, yes, I see that he could take that money back at any point, and it'd be a tax efficient way to do so. I think we have to remember as well, he's not actually extracting any money out of the club in terms of interest. That's an interest-free loan as well. So it's just that degree of flexibility from where I sit, but interested to hear your thoughts on it, Kieran. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I'm with you entirely, Gary.
And the other slight concern that is kind of news, rumours have been breaking the last couple of days about a potential high interest loan from MSD Holdings of around 35 million, if you believe certain sources, which I think West Brom did something similar. Should we be concerned about that?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of MSD Holdings. They are not football fans. They have identified that football is a pariah industry from a traditional lender's perspective. And I absolutely understand it. If I'm Santander, if I'm Barclays, if I'm HSBC, Lloyds, whoever it's going to be, do I want to lend money to a football club? Here I'll give you an example. A long time ago, I used to be an accountant, and I used to specialise in administrations. And I was once asked to do an investigation into a pretty well-known football club, which had been relegated from the Premier League, or the equivalent of the Premier League, whatever it was. I did an investigation, and then the management were just useless, absolutely useless. So that was my summary. So I drafted a report, and then out of courtesy, and this was sort of pre-mobile phone era, certainly, or when the mobile phones were about that big. So only posers used to keep them. So I phoned up the bank manager out of courtesy and says, "Look, I've written the report," and bank manager says, "Yeah, just sort of, what is the score?" And I said, I really need to think, we need to get rid of this management. So, bring us in as administrators and we'll find somebody better to run the club. And the phone went silent for a few seconds. And he said, "Any chance we could have a meeting before you formally send out your report?" I said, "Yeah, fine. Do you want me to come to your offices? Or do you want to come over to mine?" And he said, "No, can I meet you in a pub?" I'm going, "Well, that's a bit different." So meet the bank manager in the pub. And I brought the draft with me. He says, you've not sent it yet, have you? I said, "No." And he says, "Right, look, this is the score. If I'm the local bank manager who is seen as putting this club into administration, I'm probably going to lose 20%, 25% of my customers, because loads of my customers, including the corporate customers, are fans of this football club. And all of a sudden, I'm the bad guy in town. So, from a reputational point of view, from the bank's perspective, this isn't good news." And he says, "Secondly, I've got 2 kids who are at primary school, 9 and 7. If their dad is the person that puts the local football club into administration, they're going to get bullied, they're going to be teased, they're going to be subject to, and I really don't want that." So we sort of had a bit of a chat, and we went across to the football club with the report, and he said, "Right, you've got 2 choices. Either A, you commit to making severe changes, or B, this report is going to be formally given to me, and you're going into administration and you lose control of the club." And I think the club owners at the time thought, the bank's just, it's just giving a bit of verbal. We've ignored all of the warnings. And when they realised that there was some dreary accountants with no personality, sort of backing up the bank manager now, they changed their viewpoint. And can you therefore see, if you were a commercial bank manager, why get yourself into that issue of having a big overdraft or a loan to a football club in the first place? Why not just say, when they come to you, "Thanks, but no thanks, go elsewhere"? And the likes of MSD and Macquarie and so on, they filled that vacuum, because MSD doesn't care, because MSD is not based in individual towns. Macquarie are one of the most horrible organisations on the planet. You talk to people connected to Thames Water, you talk to people connected to various countries around the world who are in desperate straits, and Macquarie says, they're known as the vampire kangaroo for a reason. And it's that they have got no moral or ethical compass whatsoever, but they're very good at what they do. So therefore, they will lend to you. They don't give a damn about what football fans think of them, and they will get a good return on their investment from a lending point of view. So, I wouldn't be over chuffed if MSD comes to town, because I'd be wanting to see the rate of interest that was being charged. I'll be wanting to see the covenants if interest payments are missed, and what are the penalties for that. So they're evil, but they're a necessary evil in the sense that the commercial banks don't want to get involved.
That loss of business, it reminded us of when Sunderland fans boycotted Sugar Puffs in the 90s, but I think that's a completely different story. But just going back on the Sunderland, just very quickly, you mentioned earlier that obviously to stick with it in terms of the Brighton had a model, they had a plan. What do you see when you look at Sunderland and the way we're doing things?
I think they've identified what they're good at. The fact that match day income is the highest since 2014. It's actually match day income's actually higher than the last 3 seasons in the Premier League is indicative of they're getting fans to come in, they're getting fans to pay a wee bit more, but the crowds are very much being maintained. The growth of the commercial part of the club and the banqueting is providing additional funds. So it's a terrible thing to say. All of the sensible and boring things, I think the club's doing pretty well at. And that gives you the building blocks to allow the club to spend a wee bit more on wages and a wee bit more on player recruitment and a wee bit more on sports science and analytics and so on, which can give you those differences so that 9th becomes 8th and 8th becomes 7th and 7th becomes 6th. And I do sort of see certain parallels with sort of, the poster boys for this is the way to get promoted to the Premier League in the likes of Brentford and Brighton and so on, in that Rome wasn't built in a day. And if you keep doing the right things again and again, that will give you some additional resources to reinvest into what you're seeing on the pitch. And therefore you can expect, a marginal rise each season. And I think that's good. But the downside of that is, of course, as fans, we're impatient. We want everything today. We want that sugar rush of being in a playoff position and being in the top 2, whatever it's going to be. And therefore, the noise can get quite deafening under those circumstances. But I think they are heading in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, you said that kind of marginal increase. I mean, does that get more and more difficult? Because, does it rely on having a timely promotion? Because you imagine that starts to break down. Let's say if you're in the Championship for 8, 9, 10 seasons, which some clubs have been, does that work for that length of time?
Yeah, I mean, it took Brighton 6 seasons. They had 2 or 3 seasons when they were mid-table. They were in the playoffs 3 times. It does take time, but I think if you've got a good communication between clubs, I always say to club owners, have fans forums. We do, and I'm not trying to flog this. We do a live show for the price of football. We go to clubs. So we've been to the likes of Plymouth. We've done one at Leicester. We've done AFC Wimbledon, Accrington Stanley. We're doing one at Rotherham United. And we'll get somebody along for the club and we will talk about the finances and we will talk about them in an adult manner. And when somebody goes, well, just need to go and spend more money. And then we explain why, well, okay, well, where's that? Because at the same time, that person who says, just go and spend a few more million, if they're the first person to go and kick off when a packet of Starburst goes up by 20 pence in the club shop, because they want, and if you explain to people that spending somebody else's money, it doesn't necessarily work all the time, and you can give examples. So I think good communication, trying to establish lines of responsibility, again, all sort of the what seems a bit tedious, a bit on message, a bit trendy, a bit Guardian-ish, whatever you want to go and say. I think that is the way forwards, and then I think the majority of fans will reflect and go, yeah, actually, that they are heading in the right direction. And I'm going to, let's face it, that not renewing your season ticket is the last action of a football fan. Mm-hmm. And you do it, either you've completely lost faith in the club, or it's down to personal circumstances, and we live all living in tough times at present. But if you tell, this is what we're doing, this is what we are trying to do in terms to grow, and you can only grow the club in terms of what we can spend, is if we can go and grow the money coming in. So we do appreciate everything that you're doing as fans as well. And I think the majority of fans will give you the benefit. Look, there's idiots out there, and those idiots will continue to be idiots, however you you engage with them, however you communicate. But I think you can still get the majority of fans on board by engagement. And that engagement comes in a variety of ways. And I think with Kirill Louis-Dreyfus, he's somebody that he doesn't particularly want to go down that particular route. It could be due to it's quite intimidating being in front of a group of 500 fans or whatever it's going to be, a fans forum or a show, whatever it's going to be. So I understand that. But having somebody that can articulate and having a good chief executive, I think is really useful in these, because they can go on to the local radio station, they can come on your podcast, and you can have an adult discussion with them, and the loonies, and all clubs have them. They'll still be doing their conspiracy theories. He's trying to somehow take money out of the club and all these coppers, but they'll be loonies regardless.
So, bottom line, Kieran, in terms of Sunderland, looking at the books, would you say, as a message, we're in a decent place, and in terms of how we're doing things, we're in a good place as well?
Yeah, if I was grading these accounts, I'd probably, I've got them up here in front of my spreadsheet. I'd probably give them somewhere like a B minus.
Take that.
They've got wages under control. They invested £7 million invested in player purchases in the year. They sold some players as well. There has had to be a retrenchment in terms of the value of the squad, but it's now starting to grow. Yeah, if I take a look at the total losses made by the club over the years, Sunderland's a business which has lost the thick end of 300 million quid. And like I say, a lot of that is in the Ellis Shaw era, but they didn't do spectacularly well under Donald and Methven as well. So for a business which has lost a lot of money over the years, I think they're in a better position than they were a few years ago. You go Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday, you get 3 victories, and all of a sudden the atmosphere around the fan base, who we tend to be a bit neurotic as fans. That atmosphere can change very, very quickly and become more positive.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect note to kind of leave it on, Kieran. And I just want to say kind of thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And, running your eyes over the Sunderland books. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the invite. I work with 2 colleagues at the University of Liverpool, both of whom are massive Sunderland fans. So I get to hear a lot of their passion for the club, and also, I'm not trying to blow smoke at grass. As an away fan, it's one of the places you love to go because it's proper football, proper fan base.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be playing Brighton. Well, within the next 12 months, let's just say,
exactly.
with a bit of luck. But thank you very much, Kieran. Really, really appreciate it and appreciate your time. And Gary, you can stay on the line because I want to speak to you. I'm going to pick your brains.
I've got another 2 minutes, Chris. That's fine. Thank you.
Nice one. Cheers for your time. And thanks again for everyone for listening. Keep a lookout at Roker Report for everything during the international break. And then when the game starts again at some point, I'm sure after this kind of international nonsense that I never enjoy, keep a lookout in all the usual places for the next How We're the podcast that should be dropping very soon. But from us, bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.